I rise to speak in support of the Rights of Transgender Persons Bill 2014, which has been passed by the Rajya Sabha on 24th April 2015 and brought to this House for consideration and passage. Earlier this afternoon, we have seen a disgraceful exhibition of majoritarian bigotry in which the mere introduction of a bill on a gender issue was not sought to be permitted by the force of the brute majority in this House. What has been particularly saddening in this open and brazen display of bigotry and homophobia has been the reluctance of these people to confront their own prejudice by having an open discussion in this House. This is a House, Mr. Chairman, where all the issues governing the future of our nation, the laws and policies under which this country must run, are to be discussed. Yes, after discussion, the House is free to decide in favour or against. But to vote against discussion, Mr. Chairman, is to my mind a low in the annals, the proud annals of Indian parliamentary democracy. What I see today with this bill, however, is an opportunity to confront some of the same problems that were implicit in Section 377. In fact, 377 itself is part of what we are trying to overthrow with the rights of transgendered persons. Gender identities, different sexual orientations. Indian history has shown no example of prejudice against these people. On the contrary, in the Mahabharata, we read about Shikhandi, who, as we know, in the end got rid of Bhishma, this great hero. We also know about the whole concept of the Ardhanarishwara. After all, the idea of even God is half man and half woman. Many of us will remember how the Honourable Chief Minister of Andhra Pradesh 30 years ago, Shri N.T. Ramarao, dressed up as Ardhanarishwara and surprised his followers. But this was seen as very much in keeping with national traditions in our country. The Ardhanarishwaras, the people of transgender background, were recognized as a Napumsak gender in Vedic and Puranic literature. They were given great importance in India throughout history and even in the Islamic courts during the period of Mughal rule. The Jain texts mention an even broader concept of gender identity by speaking about the idea of a psychological sex being different from that of a physical one. Unfortunately for us, the British came and they passed laws in the Indian Penal Code and after that have criminalized a whole lot of human behavior and human reality that in India have not been criminal. It is ironic to see the self-appointed defenders of Bharatiya Sanskriti on the treasury benches now acting as the defenders of the worst prejudices of British Victorian morality. That is what we have seen this afternoon, and I want to stress that when you look at Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code, when you look at the Criminal Tribes Act of 1871, all of this targets the transgender community as well as the homosexual community, and they violate the Indian ethos and the traditions of perhaps at least 2,000 years of Indian cultural practice, Indian mythology, Indian history, our Puranas, our ways of living. We have instead been saddled with colonial era interpretations of what is good and right for Indians. We have been saddled with a morality that is not from the soil of this country, but from the soil of Victorian Britain. All the prohibitions that the ruling party so fondly clings on to today, that we have seen in their exhibition of prejudice half an hour ago, all of these are legacies of British colonial rule and have no roots in Indian practice or in Indian ethos. I want to stress, Mr. Chairman, that in modern India, the Supreme Court took the first step in 2014 to recognize the third gender, confirming their right to identify themselves as a third gender or a gender different from that assigned to them by their biological birth. In the case of the National Legal Services Authority versus the Union of India and others, the Supreme Court actually talked about the bias against such individuals who identify themselves as transgender persons in our society. And it talks about their unjust exclusion from the social, economic, and cultural activities of our society. The court stated that gender identity entails, and I quote, Mr. Chairman, a person's deeply felt internal and individual experience of gender, which may or may not correspond with the sex assigned at birth, including the personal sense of the body, which may involve a freely chosen modification of bodily appearance or functions by medical, surgical, or other means, and other expressions of gender, including dress, speech, and mannerisms, unquote. So the Supreme Court of India has upheld the importance of the gender role in securing a person's identity in our society, and therefore, if you want in this Parliament to preserve the rights of Indian citizens, then clearly gender rights are also a fundamental part of such rights. It is unfortunate that some have chosen to deny members of the transgender community these basic human rights and protections, which are available under the Constitution of India to all citizens. Article 14 of the Constitution speaks about the right of equality. Article 15 grants all of us the right to protection against discrimination. Article 16 gives us all the equality of opportunity in matters of public employment. And Article 21 gives us the right to personal liberty, life, and dignity. All of these rights are denied to the homosexual community under 377 and are denied to the transgender community under the Indian Penal Code. These are the rights that this bill seeks to restore. Let me mention what the state of Kerala has done, which has actually adopted a state policy on transgenders. And I would urge the members of the Treasury benches to pay heed to this with a view to considering a similar national policy for transgenders. The Department of Social Justice and the Government of Kerala has adopted a policy for transgender persons in 2015, which provides for the self-identification of transgender persons, provides social protection and facilities such as education, health services, housing, water supply, sanitation, employment, public awareness, including through the mass media, and requires inclusive practices in government departments, public offices, post offices, hospitals, the whole lot. Kerala has even managed to establish separate cells in the prison blocks to protect transgender persons, the first state in the country to do this. The Kerala government, as part of the state policy, has created social inclusion and sensitization workshops, working with NGOs that support this community, counseling centers for victims of violence and exclusion, crisis intervention centers, support centers, very much modeled on the one-stop crisis centers we have for women, which is part of national policy, encouraging the Anganwadi workers and the self-help groups to sensitize the parents of gender non-conforming children and youth and helping them to understand their children's problems, capacity building initiatives to train caretakers and teachers in educational institutions, workshops in law enforcing agencies, particularly the police, to prevent institutional violence by police against transgenders, and finally it has established a state transgender welfare board. Now, why can't the government do something similar at the national level? Mr. Siva's bill provides for such institutions, and I want to say that in doing this, India will simply be bringing itself up to par with the rest of the world. Let us not forget, Mr. Chairman, that the opening words of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted as far back as 1948, are very clear. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. That is what we are trying to give them. Through my earlier unsuccessful attempt to change 377, it was very much to give the same freedoms and dignity to this community, to the homosexual community, as all Indians have. And today, this bill before us gives all the protections to the transgender communities that you and I enjoy, Mr. Chairman, as free citizens of India. In 2011, the United Nations Human Rights Council became a body, the first UN intergovernmental body to adopt a wide-ranging resolution on human rights, sexual orientation and gender identity. Resolution 17/19 expressed the Council's grave concern at violence and discrimination against individuals based on their sexual orientation and gender identity, and this is something 2011 that we are now catching up with this bill of 2015. And I do want to stress, if you look at Article 2 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, to which India is a party and a signatory, each state party to the covenant undertakes to respect and to ensure to all individuals within its territory and subject to its jurisdiction the rights recognized in the covenant without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth or other status. In other words, by discriminating against transgenders, by discriminating against homosexuals, India puts itself in violation of Article 2 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. I'd also like to mention Article 12, Subclause 1 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, because that gives states the obligation to grant everyone the right to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. And the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights of the United Nations has indicated that the Covenant proscribes any discrimination in access to health care and the underlying determinants of health on the grounds of sexual orientation and gender identity. In other words, Mr. Chairman, we are simply granting people universally recognized human rights. I do feel that the government has woken up to some of this by coming up with their own version of the bill. At least there are indications of a version that they are consulting others on. I am here today to speak on Mr. Tiruchi Siva's bill as passed by the Rajya Sabha. But I do want to point out that the government version of the bill has some very diluting provisions which should not be encouraged and which, in my view, are inferior to the bill that we are discussing right now. For example, there is no provision for the establishment of national or state transgender welfare commissions in the government's bill. As I said, Kerala has already established one. We can't dilute something which has already happened, and the government becomes free of any accountability. If you have no commission to enforce the law, then you are not accountable in the law, and that's what happens. It must be noted that OBCs, SCs, STs, women all have commissions to promote their rights. Why should not the transgender community? They're also very concerned about education, Mr. Chairman. I mentioned this earlier because I received a communication from a transgender person saying that the problem is that equal access to education is fundamentally vital. I'm quoting here, "We do not agree that we need to be rescued or rehabilitated since nothing is wrong with us. Instead, there are problems with society's respect for us. Hence, we would prefer support for more education and livelihood opportunities." This is what they're asking. Kaam karne dijiye, padhai karne dijiye. They will find better opportunities than by giving rescue and rehabilitation approaches. We would prefer, they say, that the government of India, the government of states, have sufficient consultations with the transgender community to understand what they really need. I also want to stress the same thing, the right for marriage, inheritance and adoption. It may seem odd, but the fact is that marriage or marriage-like benefits for transgender couples living together, they may share a home, maybe they cannot get married under our laws, maybe it is not possible for them to be coupled or partnered biologically, but they may want to live together, they may want to be each other's primary caregivers, they might want to inherit, adopt and so on, and I think we should allow the law to protect their rights to have this kind of decent treatment. And the truth is that I've already mentioned children. We need to provide benefits for children. They are the future of our society. If we cripple these children emotionally by mistreating them as children, we are depriving ourselves as a society of the contributions they can make in future. And I want to also mention practical matters like access to bathrooms, hospitals, public transport facilities, and so on. Let me conclude, Mr. Chairman. I can see you're getting concerned about the time. I just wanted to stress that the problem with this bill is it is part of a much larger problem of colonial-era legislation reflected in the Indian Penal Code of 1860 and its subsequent amendments in the 19th century. You may be aware, sir, that our Honorable Rashtrapati Ji, Pranab Mukherjee, President Mukherjee, in a speech on the occasion marking the 155th anniversary of the Indian Penal Code, called for this Indian Penal Code to be comprehensively revised. He said it reflects a British-era Victorian 19th century morality. It reflects conditions of colonial oppression. Many of the laws, such as the sedition law, which I have brought before you in this House, reflect the desire of the colonial masters to deprive Indians of rights. And therefore, Mr. Chairman, our own Rashtrapati wants the Indian Penal Code revised. It is in this spirit that I have earlier introduced an attempt to amend Section 377, that today we are discussing the rights of transgender persons. It is a shocking thing to me that the Treasury benches, that the ruling party of this country prefers to remain anchored to an outmoded Victorian standard of penal code rather than to the values of our own society, our own culture, thousands of years of Indian history, which have given people of different sexual orientation, different gender practice, a respectable place in our society. And now, unfortunately, we are saddled with a government and a ruling party whose members want to condemn them to the ghetto of discrimination, abuse and violence. I plead with the honourable members here and with you, Mr. Chairman, to pass this bill as passed in the Rajya Sabha, to send from this House a proper signal to the rest of the country and to the nation that we belong in the 21st century, that we are a humane society, that we will treat our people, whoever they are, every Indian citizen will be granted the same rights, and we will treat them with fairness, with dignity and with justice. I thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jai Hind.
For example, we celebrated Women's Day. The Supreme Court had said allowed dance bars in Mumbai. And the Supreme Court also said that people who patronize dance bars, their right to privacy will be protected. It is amazing. People who patronize dance bars, their privacy will be protected. But what about this? What about the Indians? What about people who are outside?